Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Rosa Jiménez wash processed Ecuador from Passenger Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Passenger, based out of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel a lot over the years. However, this is our first time reviewing them since they have switched bags, and that does give me an opportunity to comment on their new bags. And I do have some slightly mixed impressions of these ones, as their recent pink bags that they did have I quite liked, as I felt like the quality of them was very nice. However, in a slightly selfish sense, I do like these new bags because they do seem to fit better in our reviews. This is a full-size bag of their coffee, whereas the pink ones were pretty tall and looked a little awkward, not just in the videos but in the thumbnails themselves. It did make for more colorful thumbnails and videos, however this one just does seem to fit better, so for that reason kind of mixed, but this works just fine for me. Anyway, this coffee is one that I have had my eye on for a while, as it is a wash processed mejorado, and I've never had a mejorado from Passenger before, and I haven't seen too many mejorados on their website. In fact, this might be the only true mejorado that I've ever seen. I do believe that they had a mixed mejorado coffee in the past, but this is the only one that I do believe they have ever offered, and the main reason I hadn't purchased it earlier was because I didn't have anything to accompany it with. So we do have one more Passenger review coming up, but for right now we will go ahead and discuss this coffee, as this right here is day 45. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a significantly toned down one at a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 90 degrees Celsius, about 194 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which does indicate a more medium grind. Roast profile of this coffee, I did check, given that I do have some samples of Passenger's older coffees in our freezer, and this one is a little bit more developed than we'd previously had from them in the past. And if anything, in comparison to the average American coffee roaster these days, I can say that this probably skews on the slightly more developed side in comparison nowadays. I should say the average American coffee roaster that we do review on this channel. I'm not talking about the ultralight ones, but kind of the more middle ground coffee roasters in general, as this one just had a bit more development to it than we had experienced from Passenger in the past. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that it's an overly developed coffee. If anything, it's still probably in that medium light range, if maybe on the slightly more medium side of that, but even then probably a little closer to that medium light by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was offering a very traditional representation of a mejorado coffee with a chocolate base in a slightly sweeter sense. A more interesting aspect of it is a slight tartness that does give it a different feel, reminiscent of the listed berry qualities. Outside of that, pretty direct, slightly robust, decent start. So that slightly robust is what I'm referring to, as this coffee, again, just felt like it had a little bit more development than what I had previously remembered from Passenger. Day 17 through the Chemex, and there's a pretty similar sentiment this time around, as it's a very traditional experience with a slight nuttiness to go along with the chocolate qualities, also a slight red fruit tartness, and perhaps not as sweet as the average mejorado, a little bit brighter than the average mejorado, but that's just based off of this try. Day 20 to the UFO brewer, and the coffee was the best that had been to this point, largely because it feels like it has toned down some of the more robust qualities to it, allowing for a better presentation of the sweeter chocolate aspects. Still a slight bit of a red fruit tartness to it, but better balanced overall, so enjoyed this experience the most as of this moment. Day 23 through the V60 with Passenger's recipe, and I remember looking at Passenger's recipe and thinking that it was not going to work for this coffee. It is a 15.67:1 at 99 Celsius, and the coffee held up surprisingly well, as it didn't seem to ramp up those more smoky, robust qualities to it to the expected extent, but it does still have a slight smokiness to go with that traditional experience, so it did amplify it ever so slightly, but maybe not as much as I would have expected. Biggest standout is more of the red fruit tartness and a little bit more brightness to this coffee, so it did seem to amplify some of the other characteristics of it as well. I had mixed feelings on that in general. Day 26 through the Chemex with Passenger's recipe, and once again this coffee holds up surprisingly well through this adjustment, as it does seem to help with the overall sweetness, offering a little bit more of the listed traditional qualities in a slightly more abundant sense, with a sugary brown sugar sweetness to it and a pretty straightforward experience once again. So coffee has been pretty direct. I expected it to be pretty direct, even with it being a Mejorado. I just fully expected the traditional characteristics of this one to be amplified in terms of the sweeter scents. Day 29 through the V60 with those lower extraction adjustments. So I went on the opposite side of the spectrum, toned it down all the way to that 15-1 at 90 degrees Celsius. I've had some really good results with that recipe when it comes to slightly more developed coffees in general. So I was curious to see how it would turn out with this one. And it was the best that I've been to this point, as it does seem to help define a lot of the milk chocolate characteristics to it. And interestingly, it's presented in the aroma of the beans themselves. So I remember when I was brewing the coffee on this day, I took in the aroma of the whole beans themselves and I said, even the beans smell like milk chocolate. So that's also kind of interesting for this one. Outside of that, there were some red fruit qualities in a more secondary sense, but the coffee was notably more cleaner and less roast to it as well. So improvement on my end. Day 33 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee was actually the best that had been to this point, as it felt like a lot of the more robust roasted qualities of this one are all but gone. So I feel like toning this one down as much as we did definitely did seem to help with that, as it's essentially presenting a cleaner, sweeter representation of a more traditional Central American coffee. Chocolate, brown sugar forward yet again with some slight candy nutty qualities to it. So definitely very nice in that sense. And on day 37, final notes we have very similar sentiment, as it has that vintage feel to it, with the traditional coffee qualities being a more sugary candy nuttiness and a caramelized sense to go with that, all with a complementary slight red fruit characteristic that's in line with the listed cherry. So very straightforward but enjoyable for what it was. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a handful of level 4s, so let's go through those. We'll start with the cleanliness, level 4. Certainly nothing to take away from the cleanliness of this one. If anything, it's extremely well defined in the qualities and characteristics that it did offer. Very well defined milk chocolate characteristic, by far the most abundant of them. Very well defined caramelized candied aspects of this coffee in terms of like the candied nuttiness to it. So yeah, pretty straightforward in that sense. Let's go ahead and move on to the finish, level 4. I will actually discuss the finish right alongside of the sweetness, because the finish does come in that lingering sort of sugary sense that is often associated with Mejorado coffee. So that works really well for me, especially given that it does have a more sweet feel to a traditional experience. So sweetness also scoring pretty high in that very sugary sense. Chocolate, level 4. I don't mind chocolate if the coffee is presented in a more sweet sense. I'm actually not a big fan of chocolate to begin with. We haven't discussed too many coffees that have been overly chocolatey these days, so for that reason, I haven't really mentioned it too much. This is one of the highest scoring chocolate tasting wheels we've had in a very long time, but level 4, by far the most pronounced characteristic in this coffee for me. All right, let's go ahead and move on. We have a handful of level 3s. We will start with the acidity, level 3. While at times it is a little bright, I don't think that this coffee was ever intended to be the brightest one out there. I've said time after time that Mejorado coffees usually fluctuate somewhere between that 3 and the 4, but this one right here, definitely on the lower side of that, not necessarily the most pronounced characteristic to this one. Florality, level 3, I can also see some honeyed characteristics to it, which is often associated with a lot of Mejorado coffees in general, and given that it has it in a slightly more sweet sense, there's enough to justify it being there at that level 3 mark. Let's go ahead and move on to the berry fruit, level 3. This is by no means a super fruit-forward coffee. Again, it presents in a very traditional sense. This is what a lot of us probably associate with being Central South American coffees, that we're drinking these in the mid-2010s, early 2010s, and this holds true to that, especially in the berry sense being the most abundant, and that cherry quality note that they have listed on here, definitely the most pronounced within this one. If I do recall correctly, I think that pairs the other characteristic that they do have, but for me, the sugariness of the palm fruit was a bit more reminiscent of kind of that brown sugar quality to this one. Caramel, level 3, I mentioned that. That's what I'm mostly associating this coffee with, is that more caramelized aspect to it, that brown sugar quality as well. So we put that there at the level 3. Savoriness is entirely the nutty characteristic of this coffee, as it did have a fair bit of that. Body, level 3, plenty of texture to this one, and even with it being brewed through the Chemex, I don't think it was too surprising given the profile of this coffee, and given that Mejorados also usually tend to fluctuate 2 and a 3 for body with a coffee on our tasting wheel. And then the final thing worth discussing, I'll discuss it briefly, is the smokiness at a level 1. I feel like most people, especially those that consider themselves to be pretty sensitive to roastiness, smokiness, will probably get at least a little bit of it from this coffee, especially if you are brewing it with a higher extraction. I mentioned that it seems to be a combination of letting this coffee age out and also going significantly lower on the extraction for the adjustments that we did make on this coffee, that we were able to get rid of all of that. I mean, it's mitigated to the point where I didn't feel like it was worth charting within this tasting wheel, but I did want to put that note in there given that some people might experience that within this coffee. So outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I enjoyed it. I think that it's not something that I would love drinking every single day for the rest of my life, but for what it was, being so traditional in the sense that it was enjoyable. Now that I think about it, it's been a very long time since I've had an Ecuadorian coffee that did act this way. It seems like the Mejorados and Sidras these days do tend to skew in a significantly more fruit-forward or even sweeter, oftentimes brighter sense. So it's not too often that I get a coffee that presents in a more chocolate-forward, more traditional, nutty-forward experience in the way that this one did. And for that reason, I enjoyed it for the time that I was working on it. But even then, I do have to say that I think my preferences have just changed from the time that I did enjoy coffees like this a little bit more than usual. And even then, there are some positives to take away. I enjoyed the fact that it was on the sweeter end of the spectrum. Kind of going into it and thinking of what this coffee was, it turned out exactly how I was hoping this coffee would turn out. Very traditional profile with a sweeter sense to it and a cleaner sense to it. And that's all I can honestly ask for when it came to this coffee. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, that's exactly the direction I would point somebody towards for this one. It's very traditional. I mean, chocolate, caramel, nuts, that's exactly what you would look for back in the day from a Central or South American coffee. Couple that with the fact that it is a little sweeter, definitely plenty of cleanliness, plenty of body to it, and you're getting a very comforting experience throughout. So that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Rosa Jiménez wash processed Ecuador from Passenger Coffee. Thank you for watching.